A report has claimed that the RAF have placed an effective pause on hiring white males in order to assist in the organisation's efforts to meet their diversity quota. The RAF has denied the claim, but the head of the recruitment team has quit amidst the controversy. Ben Obsijekti from the Advisory Council at Don't Divide Us is a former infantry officer, and he wrote about this in the Telegraph earlier this week. And he joins me tonight. Ben, welcome. So, I read about this story earlier in the week. I think it's really fascinating. But before we sort of get into the nuts and bolts of it, can you tell us your experience as an infantryman? You were in the army yourself.
Yeah, so I joined the army sort of at the age of 23 and served for 9 years. I was an infantry officer, so I commissioned from Sandhurst. I went on to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan and left sort of roughly around 10 years ago now.
Yes.
But an outstanding career and one that I thoroughly enjoyed.
So, I mean, this is an area that I know nothing about, the military, but I do know something about the diversity industry, and I find it quite interesting that these two things have come together in this way. As someone who has had that experience, do you feel that when diversity as a concept is prioritised, it can have a detrimental effect on the effectiveness of the armed forces?
It's such a strange one because for me, I was someone who didn't grow up in a military household. I wasn't exposed to the military environment, and yet I still, of my own volition, decided to join the army and had a great career there. But it was noticeable that I was one of very few sort of ethnic minority people, especially as an officer, but more widely as a soldier. We had probably more foreign and Commonwealth soldiers than we had soldiers who were British-born. So for me, it was quite, that was quite an interesting experience. It was something that I noticed, but it wasn't something that was an issue.
Yes.
And so for it to now be raised that the army wants to increase its diversity statistics, and the armed forces in general wants to increase its diversity status, means that there is always going to be some friction in the manner in which they choose to do that. And I think that's where the problem potentially comes. Is
there a fear that if you implement these kind of quotas, you might not always go for the best person for the job? And you mentioned in your article that actually in these sort of life and death situations, you always need the best person for the job. That's got to be the priority.
Absolutely the case. And the RAF has been very quick to come out and say that there's been no impact on the operational capability of the armed forces, that everybody who's been selected has been above the quality line, and so everyone that's being put through is of a sufficient standard.
Yes.
And that may be the case, but the problem is that when you start to prioritise people based on their gender or their ethnicity, you are automatically excluding other people who may well be as good at a standard, if not better. And it's vital that we always get the people who are the best people for the job, especially on operations. I think as a country, now that the likes of Iraq and Afghanistan have faded from consciousness a little bit, less for the recent discussions around Kabul, we've kind of forgotten the tempo of operations that we were operating at around 10 years ago, and sort of between 2003 and 2013. And the vast sort of sacrifice that individuals were required to do just simply means that you have to have people who are of the best quality. And that's not always going to be the case, in terms of not always going to be possible, but it's so important that we strive for that.
I mean, I can understand that if there are incidents of racism or homophobia or whatever within the army, that has to be rooted out, that has to be dealt with. But this is a sort of different thing, isn't it? This is about the recruitment process. And my understanding, as limited as it is that when you go into the army, it's not so much about your individuality, your own identity. It's about kind of being subsumed into a collective identity. Have I got that wrong?
No, absolutely. I spent 2 years in a recruitment sort of army training regiment, training recruits, and you so quickly have to take the individual as they were, rough around the edges, obviously not suited to go from civilian to soldier in an afternoon, and you quickly sort of build that cohesion. You teach people what you want from them. You teach them the values and standards that the army requires in order to bring them up to a point where they can work as a team, as a member of a team, and that's what the armed forces are. They are effectively a huge team broken down into smaller teams, and at every level somebody has to be able to operate with the people around them. You have to be able to rely on the person left of you and the person to the right of you.
Well, that community is so important, isn't it? Because you're effectively asking people to put your life in their hands and vice versa.
Absolutely, and to that extent, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force very quickly breaks people down and builds them back up in the image in which they want them to operate in.
Yes.
And the only culture that really exists is the culture of the arm or service that you're in. And it is different between the three major services, but each one has its own its own culture, and with it, its own language, its own style of operation. But that's what you're pulling everyone towards. And it doesn't matter what your gender is or what your ethnicity is. It's about whether you can operate in that cohesive team.
I think a lot of the time, a lot of people don't really understand that mindset because they haven't served, and so they don't know what that feels like. But do you think that might be part of this? The fact that these kinds of equity and diversity initiatives, which sort of originate in the corporate world, in the world of HR, suddenly being mapped onto this entirely different context, and really they don't fit very neatly.
I mean, in this instance, it very much seems that this is just a case of meeting an arbitrary target that somebody has set because it has been deemed that we have under-recruited in terms of gender, in terms of ethnic minorities. And looking at that and looking at the fact that they're just desperate to get bums on seats, effectively, in order to be able to say, well, we hit our target, we've got 2.5 or 2.7% of ethnic minorities, means that you are in danger of losing the bigger picture, and which is effectively the operational capability of your force, getting the best people through the door, and making sure that that's the case. Because in the corporate world, you can lean into the cultures of the various people that join in order to sort of broaden the horizons of the people that are there. But in the armed forces, you're making everybody work to the culture that you set,
yes,
which is that of the armed forces. And so people aren't going to invest time in learning about the rich cultural heritage of various individuals because it's not going to have any influence on the overall organisation.
No, of course. Do you think that the notion of representation, and I take this because one of the arguments presented when this argument came up was that it's important that the armed forces are representative of the country they represent, right? So I can see how that might be important in a policing situation where you have people who are within the communities that they serve. How important is that concept of representation when it comes to the army?
It's such a complex sort of scenario. I mean, obviously for the police, you are intrinsic to the community, you are seen on the ground, you have to interact with people on a daily basis. Most people have very little interaction with the armed forces. Unless you live in a garrison town or you live in Portsmouth or something like that, you're not going to come across the armed forces on a particularly regular basis. And therefore that sort of civil-military interaction is far less important. In terms of representation, I don't think anybody is sitting around wondering or worrying, in fact, whether we have the right amount of black people or Asian people serving on the front line. I think people just want to know that the Army or the Navy or the Air Force works as it is intended to work.
Well, a lot of people argue that any kind of disparity in outcome when it comes to recruitment is a sign of a kind of ingrained institutional racism within the system. Do you think the Army has a problem with racism?
I don't think the Army has a problem with racism. I wouldn't have spent 9 years in the Army if it did. I think there is a perception that the Army has a problem with racism, and I think sort of historically, if we look back to sort of before my time in the 70s and the 60s, I would be very surprised if there weren't sort of a number of horrendous incidents. But this is 2022, and the Army is quietly become a very progressive organisation in terms of the way that it deals with bad behaviour. We saw late last year there was a number of incidents with senior officers in the Army, and that led to some serious questions being asked at the very highest level about the culture that existed. I remember seeing various senior officers on television sort of defending the manner in which the Army was operating because of the uncomfortable work, the dirty and dangerous work that it's required to do. And so there have been moves to address that, and I think there have been very positive moves, and it's one that makes the Army a more welcoming and a slightly softer, dare I say it, place.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily always going to be what you need, but at the same time, the vast majority of the time isn't spent on operations, so you need people to be willing to stay in the organisation in order to get the best out of them.
Does it need to be soft? I mean, isn't the Army a military force?
Sorry, maybe I didn't articulate that sort of well enough. I think sort of toxic behaviours are those things that you need to make sure that are kept out. In terms of it being a sort of a tough environment, I think the very nature of the work means that you're always going to ask a lot from people. But at the same time, the people that you've got in place are equipped to do that. And
yes.
That's the whole process of the recruitment process is in order to get the right people at the sharp end.
Do you ever fear, though, that these kind of diversity initiatives can sometimes change the public perception of the armed forces in a really negative way? I mean, I'm thinking of on the day that Putin invaded Ukraine, a story was broken about MI6 and MI5 urging spies to address their white privilege. On the day of the invasion, there was also a tweet from the Ministry of Defence talking about how great their LGBT coffee morning that was that day and how they discussed pansexuality. Doesn't that make them look like, well, it looks foolish?
It's very much a case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. And I think that you have to look at it holistically, and you have to recognise that the public perception of the armed forces is very different to the way that the armed forces perceives itself internally.
Yes.
And I think there are a lot of people in the armed forces who've been in the armed forces for a long time, and there is a lot of institutionalisation within that. If you've spent 20 or even longer in the army, then you're going to have a slightly skewed sort of appreciation of just how people see things from the outside. And so it is worth sort of addressing those kind of issues. I think on the subject of diversity, the work that they do in terms of sort of diversifying their workforce is one that they should be doing simply so that they can ensure that they have the most people engaged in order to get the best people from that. I don't think it's a case of making sure that you can meet quotas and numbers. It's making sure that you can engage as many people as possible to get the best people in the job. And if you happen to diversify your workforce in the process, then that's obviously a massive bonus.
Ben Obstetrician, thanks very much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. We do have a statement from the RAF, which is only fair to read. This is an RAF spokesman said, there is no pause in Royal Air Force recruitment and no new policy with regards to meeting in-year recruitment requirements. Royal Air Force commanders will not shy away from the challenges we face, building a service that attracts and recruits talent from every part of the UK workforce. As with the Royal Navy and British Army, we are doing everything we can to encourage recruiting from underrepresented groups and ensure we have a diverse workforce.